Welcome to JerseyTalkRadio.com. I'm Bruce Pearson, hosting a show with David White. And David, we've always had interesting discussions in your show about the art and science of business and your expertise in assisting businesses, especially smaller businesses and businesses that are family-owned and operated, single generation or multi-generational.
Sure.
So what is, for the viewers that are tuning in or listening in for the first time tonight, the name of your business, and let's talk about your special focus, and then we'll talk about tonight's show.
Okay. The name of my company is Performance Leadership Systems. We do performance consulting work, and the focus is really on trying to help companies learn how to turn their people into a competitive advantage. So it's all about the people side of the organization, which is why we've named this show The People Side, a Fresh Perspective.
And tonight's topic,
I'd like to talk a little bit about trust in organizations, because it's an interesting phenomena. It's hard to establish, and yet it can make a huge difference in how companies operate. But fundamentally, trust involves the decision one way or the other to make yourself vulnerable in some fashion to another person, and that's at the essence of trust. And it's particularly difficult to develop within companies because the hierarchy gets in the way. If you're in a hierarchy and you report to someone, in a sense, you're already in a position of vulnerability relative to that individual because there's a power imbalance, right? And so what happens is, you're reluctant to trust because you're only going to increase your vulnerability that much more. And there's a limit to how vulnerable people want to be. So you don't see it happening very often where there's trust on the part of subordinates for their managers. And it also is problematic going the other way, too, and we can talk about that a little bit. But that's, in essence, what I'd like to talk most about tonight, Bruce.
Okay, I'll ask you a supremely unscientific question, an unfair question. What do you feel the level of trust between management and employees is in American business generally? High, low, or on a sliding? I mean, is it high? Is it low? Is it where it should be?
No, it's low. It's very low.
And is that reflective of what happens in the economy and employment, or does that swing in ebb and flow, or does that pretty much is that the nature of how we teach our business leaders, or what?
Well, to the degree that people feel vulnerable and are afraid of losing their jobs, obviously that decreases trust. To the degree that people feel trapped and to some degree possibly taken advantage by their companies because their companies know that it's going to be very difficult for them to find another job, that's going to all reduce trust. By the same token, when the economy is better and people are leaving all the time, then that reduces trust on the part of employers. So it's a shifting thing, but the well-managed companies usually do make an effort to build trust with their employees. Now, it eventually comes down to the manager and the individual. And what they say is that people leave bad managers; they don't leave companies. So it depends on the individual relationship. But no, I mean, I used to have I think I told you this story once before. I had a professor who used to talk about the latent paranoia within companies. And obviously that's reflective of a lack of trust. And I thought that was a little over the top, and so I challenged him, and he said, okay, Mr. White, you tell me, how often does the grapevine carry good news, and how often does it carry bad news? And I sat down and said, you're right, no. Forget I ever stood up. So, it's the nature, again, I think a lot of it has to do not so much with the individuals, but just the nature of a hierarchy. Having someone who basically has more power than you do and kind of holds your fate to some degree in their hands, and that makes people feel vulnerable, and therefore they're going to be less apt to want to trust and make themselves that much more vulnerable. By the same token, it also works the other way, Bruce, where because someone reports to you as a superior, that affects how you perceive their behavior. And how much, when they do things or whatever is, well, how are they doing this because they want something from me, right? As
Right.
opposed to they're just a good, solid person and I can trust them. And so it really does, it works both ways. And it's the thing that's so hard about trust is it takes a long time to build.
And a short time to destroy.
And it is very, very vulnerable. It can, the metaphor I like to use is one of a giant oak. How long does that take to grow, and how quickly can it be cut down? And that's the same thing with trust.
All right, so how do you determine in your organization if the boys above you and girls above you are trustworthy?
Well,
Told you I'd give you that fair question.
Turn it around. When you think of people who are trustworthy, what makes them trustworthy?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Because it varies for each individual.
Well, that their value system doesn't swing in the breeze like the Garden Gate, that they do not succumb to outside pressures at your expense without good reason, or without at least advising you that they don't blindside you. You're not sandbagged and made the sacrificial chicken. I mean, there's a number of tangible ways that you're not thrown in front of the bus every time something goes wrong.
You're scapegoated.
Exactly.
Hung out to dry.
That they do not put the rank in front of every good achievement, and by your lack of input, insinuate or directly blame you for every negative outcome.
Okay, so
because you're not there to speak for yourself. So the guys under me screwed up.
They're not grabbing the credit for stuff that you've done
on the
that's
good side and nailing you to the wall on the back side of it.
Yeah, when it's convenient for them.
I continually don't understand why businesses don't, at least, even if they don't, and they can make it very clear that they don't have to take the advice or the suggestions, why they don't solicit input from anyone below the executive office in most cases. The silly little suggestion box is an indicator of whether they value your intelligence or your commitment to the company, to the organization.
Right.
They don't have to read them. They could be filled with spitballs and candy wrappers. But there may be a lot of good ideas floating around in there that could help the company.
Yeah.
There just may be one or two that could save them big money.
Sure. Yeah. In a previous life doing consulting work, we used to do a lot of employee surveys. And the beauty of an employee survey is that it bypasses all of the different levels of the hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of the problems of communications within a company is it's the old telephone game. Going down through 5 levels is the same as having 5 people around a table, and you start with one message and it ends up completely different and distorted by the time you get to the 6th person.
Right.
Well, the same thing happens to communications that's going up, and it also happens to it happens to communications going down, but it also happens to communications going up. The other thing is, if there's a lack of trust, it impacts the communications. And how many companies, and think about your own experience, Bruce. Did you talk?
I'd rather not, actually. Sorry.
How often did you talk to your boss the same way you talk to a coworker?
I've had pretty close relationships with my bosses.
Okay.
I mean, where I think if you set up that, and even in the military, my reserve service, the respect was there, the military decorum was there.
Yeah.
The appropriate nature was yes, sir, or whatever, or captain this or whatever.
And everyone went through that.
And yet, when we're talking about tangible issues, problems, discussions. That did not get in the way of two adults discussing an issue
Okay.
on an even keel.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it got to the point of policy, protocol, procedure, and so on, then I would defer to military discipline to say, well, sir, it's up to you.
Right. It's your
But here's the deal. I mean, this guy did this, or this happened here, and this is
Mm-hmm.
my suggestion, or this might work better. There was no silly, constructed framework that,
Mm-hmm.
that got in the way to that. I know it's inevitable when somebody's got the hammer over your head, whether it's figuratively or literally, that you don't measure your words hopefully better than you would to a subordinate. But having
or
said
even
that,
a coworker.
a coworker.
Sure.
So I'm not saying I'm immune to that
Yeah.
influence, but by and large, I think that if you're in a professional environment, where I've seen it is my work where it's the occasional visit to the major corporation where I'm an outsider visitor, a vendor, a contractor, a freelancer, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and watching people dancing around like they're standing on the hot coals of a barbecue,
Right.
just completely mitigating any efficiency because they're so worried about saying the wrong thing, saying the right thing,
And getting in trouble for it.
oh yeah, my God, what's this here?
Yeah, I
He really
know.
doesn't like this, like like it's Louis III coming through the
Right.
door,
Yeah.
to the point where it's distracting, it's self-defeating, it's silly.
Well, it interferes with the communication.
It absolutely interferes with the job.
Yeah. Sure.
It's like, come on, why don't you guys lighten up? I mean, this guy's not going to bite your head off.
Well, some
Maybe he
people-
is.
Yeah. Exactly.
Or she is.
We've got to mention that we're going to welcome calls.
Yes, absolutely. And
So
I
if
need
you have
that.
any questions or comments,
Yeah, go ahead and give that number out, and
okay,
I'll get
yeah.
it on the air here in a minute.
please call in. Number is 908-347-7793. The other interesting phenomena about trust, and this is just my own perspective, Bruce, but I think as you go higher within the organization, the trust level actually decreases because the people have increasingly more to lose and there's more at risk. So they feel more vulnerable than ever, believe it or not, even though they may be higher in the hierarchy. A great story I heard from a fellow consultant was he was working with a very large company executive team, and he was in there doing consulting work. And they would have meetings with the CEO. And the CEO would talk to members of the executive team but would refuse to make eye contact with them. He would never, when he was talking to someone, he would never make eye contact with them. Well, you can imagine how uncomfortable that made everybody. And it was a power tactic to keep people intimidated. And the consultant said, this is a very large company, so these people around that table were being very, very well compensated, and they were all terrified. And this CEO purposely kept each and every one of those people off balance.
Well, I think that's disingenuous and
Yeah.
sneaky and silly,
Yeah,
unprofessional.
but it happens. I've heard stories. I worked for one company and had actually a person who was a very good manager, and he got called to speak to the board, not the board of trustees, but not the board of directors, but the executive committee board. And he went up and went into the conference room, and every person around that table was sitting like this with their elbows spread, and their elbows were practically touching one another. And no one would move, even though he invited him to the meeting. No one would move, right, to make room for him at
That's
that table.
sick. That's childish.
Yeah, but it's they're protecting their turf.
Well,
Because-
literally.
Yeah, and you think there wasn't backbiting and infighting between that group? Everyone's jockeying position, and everyone's a potential threat to what they have.
And what
so-
was his job?
Pardon?
What was his
Well, later on, he became the head of HR, which was interesting. And I'm not going to name the company, but he said,
I think you should.
no, no. He told me in confidence that, had he known the respect that the CEO had for HR, he never would have taken the job. And I think he eventually ended up leaving. But he was a very solid individual. And but I mean, it just gives you an idea of what happens at that level. And that. I mean, stop and think about it. You have two executive committees, Bruce. One of them has worked for a long time together. They've been through a lot of problems together. They fought with each other. They've argued with each other, but they've always managed to come up with solutions that worked, and they've been successful. All right? And then you have another executive committee that there's backbiting, there's hidden agendas. People are, positioning themselves for the president's job and, backstabbing kind of things. Take those two committees and now put them in this situation. The company's going through a really difficult time, and they're losing money. And the president, leads this board, this executive committee, has just been notified that he's got 6 months to turn it around or he's gone. Now, what do you think's going to happen differently between those two companies in terms of those executive boards? More specifically, what is the likelihood that a CEO is going to take the second committee and say, look, here's the situation, folks. I've got 6 months, and that's all I've got. We got to turn this around or I'm going to lose my job. Is that person going to say that with all the board that's doing all the backbiting?
Point taken.
Yeah. So which one is going to be more effective in the long run? I mean, if you had to put your money down on which of those boards do you think is going to be best for the work the most effectively, which one do you think it's going to be? Right?
Well, you're the expert, so
well, it's going to be the one that people can talk and they do trust to one another.
Of course.
And they can disagree with each other without taking it personally. Mm-hmm. And they're not backbiting. I mean, they may not like each other even, but they can work together. And that's the important thing.
So whatever happened in that company?
It's just actually it's a case study that I used when I do executive team building. I usually start the executive team building off with this exercise so that they can see how that single factor, the issue of trust, can have such a dramatic impact on how they function as a team.
So in those situations, how many companies take your advice in your past history and actually do that?
Actually do what?
Take your advice and implement it.
You mean in the team building?
Yes.
My job is not really to give them advice. My job is to take them through a process where they discover how they're functioning and can generate ways to become more effective. I can point them in the right direction, but the model I use for consulting is not a doctor-patient model. It's more of a joint problem-solving model. And there's a big difference. So I'm not saying, okay, do this or do that. I really don't work that way.
Okay.
They've got to have a hand in the generation of the solution so that they take ownership of it. Otherwise, well, we did what the consultant said and it didn't work, so not my fault. And a lot of big companies use consultants that way, so they got a potential scapegoat.
Well, that's what I was talking about. How you trust somebody if you're just being set up for the fall guy to fall on the sword if it doesn't go right, and yet you're not going to get any credit if it goes superbly because the guy above you is going to take all the credit and nobody even knows you exist.
Right.
Oh, how can you trust them?
Well, that's I just met with a client today and he has some issues that he's dealing with, and we were talking about earning trust, and I said that was my job. My job was to earn his trust, because he was dealing with some potential new people that were asking for a lot of money, and he was kind of balking at it and say, I don't know these people. I don't necessarily trust them. And I said, I don't blame you.
So how do you work around that generally?
How do I work around what?
Well, how does one work around that if you don't trust the people above you or below you in either case?
You learn to cope.
And what does that mean in the real world?
Well, in the real world, that means that you identify the people that you can and you can't trust, right? To the degree you can, you probably want to avoid the people that you can't. And if you're forced to interact with them, you're going to be careful, right? You're probably going to engage in more, CYO kinds of behaviors than you normally would. I've worked with certain people. I made darn sure that I kept real careful records of all my emails, because I wanted a track record for what was going on, because I did not trust the person that I worked for, and I knew I could get hung out to dry any minute.
That makes it a lot of fun driving into work in the morning.
Yeah, you really look forward to going to work. But you find people that you can trust and you build a relationship with them. And the people that you can't trust, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how people handle this issue. To my mind, there are three things that go into trust. One is the person's capacity to trust. And we don't all have the same ability just to trust people. It involves a certain risk, right? Mm-hmm. So that's number one. The second thing is, to what degree do you perceive the other person as being trustworthy? I'm sure you can think of people that you've interacted with that, you've said to yourself, man, I wouldn't trust that person as far as I could throw them.
No, I don't think I've ever run into anybody like that.
Yeah.
In New Jersey, I don't think so.
Oh, you think it's unique to New Jersey?
Oh, everybody's trustworthy in New Jersey.
Oh, really? That's
yeah,
a good thing you told me that.
Didn't you know that?
Yeah. No, I didn't know that.
I read that on a sign coming into town here.
Yeah.
Especially in Flemington.
Well, it's funny. Have you ever run into someone who insisted on leaving their car doors open because they said, well, you should be able to trust people? Have you ever encountered someone like that?
Yeah, that's like, okay, I'm going to force the system to be square.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead. Let me know when your stereo's going.
Well, that's just it. Someone who does that actually has a very low capacity for trust, because the reality of that situation is what ultimately, eventually, is going to happen.
Well, let me guess.
Yeah, something's going to be missing from their car. And guess what that person ends up saying to themselves? You just can't trust people these days. So they're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that justifies their lack of trust and their inability to trust people. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Okay.
Well, and I think that comes into the management play when you say, well, all right, we're going to let you guys work something out on the floor yourself. Let's see how that goes. And the minute it doesn't go right, say, we tried to tell you guys that you're not worth it. You're a bunch of idiots. And
yeah.
We gave you your rope. You hung yourselves with it. Now don't ever ask again.
Well, that's one of the... To really delegate and allow people to have autonomy to do their work, it requires a lot of trust on the part of a manager.
I don't think you build relationships in major corporations to the extent anymore, because nobody's there long enough to build a good relationship. Maybe that's an overstatement, cynical statement, but I think in many cases people churn through so fast that you don't build any relationships.
Well,
or you don't build the kind that you used to.
There's less of it to some degree, because the days of a 20 and 30 year career are pretty much gone, right?
Yeah. Unless you're in Congress.
We're not going there, Bruce.
most of us with jobs don't have franking privileges, so we don't get to we don't
yeah.
get to take time during our job to promote ourselves at the $10,000
We could
plate
spend the rest
dinners.
of our life talking about the dysfunctionality of Congress and not accomplish a damn
Well,
thing.
it is an election year, so
I know.
I thought I'd throw that into the mix to
Yeah.
further muddy the waters for you.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
So, in any case, and then the last of those three factors, first the ability to trust, and then the perception of the other person, how trustworthy they are. And then the last thing is there's sort of a conscious or a unconscious cost-benefit ratio, that people calculate in their head. In other words, what's the downside? How much will it hurt if I trust this person and I get let me down?
We have a call.
Oh, cool.
Hello, caller. You're on the air. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I have a question for Dave.
Go ahead, sir. You need to turn your radio down because there'll be a delay.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, fire away.
My question, I'm listening to the discussion on trust,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the mechanical things that I found is the old concept of hitting singles instead of going for home runs.
Okay.
That you actually plot out some things where you can demonstrate that you work well, and the success that you have in those small objects or small projects gives you the basis for trusting people.
I think you're absolutely right, because I think building trust is a small incremental process. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen with one big, event kind of a thing. It is a series of smaller, incremental, and reciprocity, right? Events.
Yes, sir.
That basically the relationship and the trust builds over time because of you both demonstrate that you have an appreciation for what the other person does, you have trust in them, and you are worthy of their trust too. And so, the idea of singles is much more important than home runs.
Thank you, Dave. This is Ron.
Okay. Thanks, Ron.
Bye.
Thanks for calling, Ron. Well, that's an interesting point. You take it in small increments or try to...
Yeah.
Well, I just think anything that's relational value happens in small.
Yeah.
Unless you save somebody's going over the cliff by grabbing onto their shirt collar, I guess. Maybe those things happen quickly. But other than that, it's probably kind of a much more plotting, methodical
process. Right. Yeah, it's a give and take for the most part. So, the other point I wanted to make about trust was that, I think there's something inherently, people want to be able to trust people. I think it's kind of we'd like to be able to. And so, I don't want to say there's a yearning for it, but you want to have it. Because let's face it, your most important relationships typically are characterized by a certain degree of trust, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but I also feel that in today's more competitive society, I think that it's a value that is harder and harder to find. And I think the tougher times are, the tougher it is to trust people. I think, look at the mindset of I used to live in New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
People were far more trusting and easygoing out there than they are in Manhattan. Say good, bad, or indifferent. It's my opinion. I think it's pretty accurate. I don't think it's way out of line. I don't think people are... and so I think that in a more competitive environment, a more urban society, a more stressed out populace, tough economic times, all the things that we're dealing with right now, I think it's harder and harder to find trust.
Well,
is that an overstatement?
No,
again?
I don't think so. Because people are feeling more and more vulnerable.
I think
the
so.
more vulnerable they feel, the less willing they're going to be
defensive
to trust.
Right.
Yeah, and then the more they're going to want to hold on to what they have.
Yes.
The other also is, competition there are two ways to compete. You can compete by trying to become better than the other person, okay? Or you can compete by trying to take them out at the knees.
That's a very interesting point, because it's become my opinion, in which I'm sure it's not novel, but we were always led to believe that the capitalist system was built on, the strong, competition in the most admirable ways. That is, the best product, the cheapest price, the most efficient production model, the most egalitarian value system.
Right.
In fact, if you look at the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Chases, the Rockefellers, their idea of capitalism and how it's actually played out is to grab your competitor by the throat and choke the life out of them, because then you come out on top. So that's competition with unbridled competition with a baseball bat.
Right.
So I think that spills over in personal relationships too. I don't think it's may the best man win. It's may the strongest guy or the guy with the fastest draw.
Well, it's like Darwinism, the manifest destiny and survival of the fittest kind
and
of
all
thing. And that's unbridled capitalism, and that's why that's what you had in the early 1900s.
I don't think it's any different now. I just don't think it's necessarily done with bayonets and mortars.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's a different kind of economy. There is a little bit more regulation. I don't want to get into the politics.
So you won't get in? You won't let me suck you into any of that stuff?
No, good try. And we could talk all about too big to fail and all that kind of stuff, which.
And perhaps we should.
Nah, I don't think so.
I'm sure you have an opinion on it.
I certainly have an opinion on it, but I do see.
But that's not the focus of tonight's show.
Yeah,
clearly.
and I do see that as part of it. I think government has a role. That's why you've got the antitrust laws and things like that. That's what they're there for.
Well, yeah. I mean, how did that work with Exxon and Mobil?
Who again?
Yeah, really. How did that work with the airlines? Didn't work too well, did it?
Not
really.
I don't know.
Or the cable companies or broadcast outlets or the FCC.
They broke up AT&T.
Yeah, they sure did. And I guess that was to suffice for every other industry in this country forever.
I don't know, Bruce.
I'm just asking you the tough questions because
you're just trying to suck me into
inquisitive
political
our viewers and listeners are sending me text messages asking me to do that every minute.
I see. So it's not your fault.
Oh, it's not my fault. I'm just a moderator.
Right, you're just
a mouthpiece.
On the questions that are coming your way.
I'm just speaking for the populace.
Now, going back to your question about, the degree of trust and when you encounter people, that you can and couldn't trust. The other thing is, how important is the relationship to you in your organization with regard to what it is that you're responsible for doing? Okay? If there are people that you can't trust, but what they do doesn't have a significant impact, then avoid them. Just stay as far away from them as you can, right? When you have to work with people that you can't trust or you don't trust, and they don't trust you, that's when it becomes a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I think one of my failings, if I were to look at self-analysis, is I tend to trust people too soon.
Okay.
And too fully for my own good.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's germane, but I think in the workplace too. You work with people, you share your feelings or views. That's probably not a good thing.
Yeah.
Generally, I think it's probably a bad policy.
Well, I tend to be careful. Okay. And I'll trust people until they demonstrate to me that they don't warrant my trust.
But in my experience, it's too late. Then the horse is out of the barn.
This is why it's incremental. Yeah. It's like sticking one toe in the water and see how the person responds when you make yourself vulnerable, right? Because if you're trusting them, you are making yourself vulnerable. And
well, that's a very good way to. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting fact of what trust the price is exacted from you for trusting someone. You're making yourself vulnerable.
Yeah, you are.
To the point you may put your job on the line.
Could be.
Could be. Could very well happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is why, like I said before, most of the time, I mean, we've all had probably good enough bosses that we feel we could pretty much say anything to them and they actually wanted to hear what we had to say. But we've also had the other bosses who you knew darn well you had to be careful about what you said, right? I can remember doing a seminar a long time ago. I was leading a seminar at AT&T, and we were talking about communications and the issue of, to what degree could you talk to your boss the same way you talk to a coworker? Mm-hmm. And there was one very young person who said, I can absolutely talk to my boss the exact same way I can talk to a coworker, don't have to hold anything back. And there was a long silence, and there was an older, more gray-haired individual in the room, and he finally said, if you think you're talking to your boss the same way you've been talking to a coworker, you've been smoking something funny. And it was like he had the last word. No one was going to dispute it. And, it's because when people are unhappy, they want people to agree with them. They want people to say, you're justified in feeling that way. So they want what's called validation. Well, where are you going to get the validation? Are you going to go to your boss? Or you're going to go to a coworker for that? Where's the greater probability you'll get the validation you want?
Coworker.
Yeah, exactly. Coworker. Even if they don't agree with you, they'll probably say something because it's just easier to do so. You go to your boss and you run into the probability or the chance that he or she's going to say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. And that's an instant communications killer because it's like, oh, I shouldn't? Great. Tell me how I change it. I didn't ask to feel this way. It's just, the emotion is not something you consciously make a choice about. And so people tend to avoid their boss when they are unhappy about something, right? Much rather go to someone who's going to agree and say, yeah, I don't blame you if you're feeling that way. If I were you, I'd feel the same way. That's what they want. And again, it goes back to, partially goes back to the issue of trust and the issue of the hierarchy, the vulnerability that people feel. And like you said, when things are tight and people are losing their jobs and jobs are harder and harder to get, it's going to make trust that much more difficult to establish because people are already feeling vulnerable and they're going to be reluctant to open themselves up to feel more vulnerable.
So how does management assist their employees to trust them? What is the mechanism?
Well,
if there is one.
Yeah, well, first of all, you'd be surprised how seldom the issue even gets discussed. Yeah.
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. All right, but, how often does a manager even bring up the issue of trust with his or her subordinates?
Frankly, I don't ever remember hearing that in my career of all the jobs I've had, because I believe they really don't think it's germane. They don't give a damn whether you trust them or not. They don't care whether you trust them or not. You work here.
Yeah.
Trusting me doesn't have any influence on whether I'm going to fire you tomorrow or you're going to stay on the job next week. So I don't think they give a damn about it.
They don't see it as being an issue that's relevant.
I've never heard anybody discuss it, ever.
Yeah. I asked a boss once if she was ever going to trust me. She didn't know what to say. Now, this was an individual...
No.
Huh?
Because the answer was no.
Well, this was an individual who was the epitome of a micromanager. She had to have her fingerprint on every single thing that happened. So she didn't trust anybody. Well, if you've ever encountered someone who is that distrusting, how can you possibly trust them? Right? It's not going to happen. And it's like she had no idea. When I asked her if she was ever going to trust me, she just fell silent. She didn't even, it's like, what are you talking about? Yeah, because I had done something and she said, oh, you should have run that past me first. And I just looked at her and I said,
seriously?
Are you ever going to trust me? And she just looked at me, it's like, why would I do a stupid thing like that?
So, what does that portend for the profitability of American businesses?
Well, look, we've survived this long without a lot of trust within within.
One could argue we're on borrowed time. Maybe we haven't survived. We just haven't taken our last breath as an economy.
Well, you could make an argument that we have peaked and we are slowly slipping downward. A lot of people would maintain that's where we are now.
I just don't sense working with a lot of major corporations, not small businesses, but having been with many small businesses, that I don't think we're working towards an enlightened workforce, a collegial, let's get everybody involved in the quality circles and improve the performance and solicit some ideas from the bottom, and let's develop. You never hear anybody talking about workforce development anymore at any level.
Well,
training and
the engagement, the whole issue of the work that's being done around the issue of increasing employee engagement. That's real. That is real, and I don't think we've got a real good handle on it yet, but at least it's out there, and people are, trying to do some things to increase the level of engagement of their employees, because the research results are very dramatic. The companies that measure as high in engagement compared to ones that are low in engagement, they are so much more productive.
What is the average, and I'm sure it's all over the scale because you can't, but what's the average turnover in major American business of their workforce?
Right now?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is it going up or going down, would you say?
Well, it's been down for a voluntary turnover.
Because there's no jobs. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's relatively low because people aren't leaving their jobs unless they can find another one, and so
generally that's not going to happen.
Yeah, the voluntary turnover is probably fairly low. It usually is. I mean, stop and think about it. If you know there are no jobs out there, are you going to leave the one?
Yeah, so that's not reflective of, geez, I'm a happy camper. It's reflective
it's
of,
not reflective.
It's even colder out there than it is in here.
Yeah, I try to explain to companies that it's a two-edged sword, and people have very long memories, and they know when they've been taken advantage of, and as soon as that spigot turns, the people who feel that they've been taken advantage of are going to be looking to leave. But it hasn't happened yet. The economy, I don't think the labor market has bounced all the way back yet.
No, because I think it's so skewed by people that are underemployed or stopped looking, just because they're punching a clock for 29 hours because they're under that threshold for benefits doesn't mean that all's happy in downtown America.
Yeah, and to your point, the use of contractors and temporary employees is
rampant.
Is a lot more than it used to be in the past, and that's probably skewing the unemployment figures to some degree. Though
Exactly.
I think they try to measure it, but so, but but the worm will turn. Okay.
But do you see business owners even looking in this direction, in your direction, to,
the smart ones?
So that hasn't gone away completely.
No, the smart ones, because the smart ones realize that an engaged labor force,
is a huge benefit.
It is.
It's an asset.
It is a tremendous asset, and
This is why I don't understand, Dave,
advantage.
Why they don't try to motivate the workers. Throw them a bone, whatever it takes to keep happy campers on the work floor than disgruntled workers.
Well,
why can't they just say, look, we're going to give this a try. Let's try to incent them with something positive instead of the sledgehammer over their head.
Because the sledgehammer is easier.
Oh, I agree.
The sledgehammer
just put a
is
gun
easier.
to their temple and say you're going to work. Or
yeah, and remember we talked about this last time, the role of a manager, right? And how the fact.
Hey, we've got a call here. Let's take this call.
Okay.
Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yeah, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of need to trust. It feels like we've kind of gone around that, but I've been in organizations where they had compelling reasons why people had to come together, and they were able to use those compelling reasons, putting them out in front of them. And it was either you bond, if you want to call it trust, or we go under. How does that factor in?
Well, it's if you're in a do or die situation, kind of a lifeboat situation, and you need to come together in order to not go under. Is that kind of the situation you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically. I worked with General Motors, and they did a program called Team Build.
Okay.
And the whole point of that was that they were losing their shirts and their market share, and the reason was there was a huge difference between management and the hourly worker. The program was meant to bring those folks together, saying either we come together and we establish some basis for having common, I'll use the word, trust in each other, or we're going under. We need your input, therefore we've got to reach out to you, and you need our support. And so with those two things, I thought it was a pretty effective program, but it definitely was driven by need.
Yeah, well, it's kind of in a crisis situations that companies will be willing to try things like that, okay, because they know that their survival probably depends on it. And by kind of setting up, like, we are in a lifeboat and we're going to go down together unless we figure out how to row together, right?
Exactly.
That's our only alternative. The only problem with that is that sometimes when you remove the overwhelming threat, let's say the crisis passes, the tendency is for that kind of cohesiveness to disintegrate because the need goes away. So it really, it's a false kind of cohesiveness to some degree, unless the company is smart enough to really sustain it when things get better.
There you go. Because it does have actual benefits.
Yeah,
and that
if
is
they
the
see
issue.
that.
If you don't generate the benefits, well, then obviously it is going to fade. But if it does, then you incorporate it. And I found that General Motors kind of did that to the tune of one of the more profitable years. And they did a lot of hard things to get there. And so that trust was very,
well,
very
they also had a kind of unique situation in that they were heavily unionized. And the unions, in that situation, it tends to be more of an adversarial relationship by definition, right? Yeah, you're on opposite sides, and we want we want more of what you have. Wasn't that Samuel Gomper's famous quote when they asked what the unions want, and he said more, right?
Correct.
So that made it that much more difficult to overcome that kind of distrust that existed very deeply.
Well, and I think that distrust leads to the concept of, well, we helped you bail out the lifeboat. Now you tell me to go sit back in the back and shut up and sit down again because I'm no longer necessary. So
yeah, the crisis is past.
Get back to your spot.
Yeah.
Be thankful we didn't throw you overboard.
Yeah.
To lighten the load.
There's a great book written by James Clavell, King Rat, and it was about a Japanese war camp, U.S. soldiers in a Japanese war camp, and this lowly person in the army hierarchy was the kingpin in the camp because he could get anybody anything, so he was King Rat, so to speak. And when they finally were freed, the transformation was incredible because he automatically got put back into the place he had been in, the lowly private kind of a thing, and it was amazing. It was a great story about how that shifts depending on what's going on outside.
I agree, Dave. That was a great book and a pretty sad ending.
Yeah, very.
But if I could just real quickly, though, I'd like to go back to that issue is when you build that trust,
Right.
because I was hearing that it's not doable, but when you do build that trust, the things that you do produce need to be acknowledged, applauded, watered, weeded, and that's how you preserve it.
Yeah, because otherwise you feel like it's not appreciated. But it's always interesting. We think of our behavior, but in the final analysis, it really depends on the person who's deciding whether or not to trust and their perception of the other individual. And you can't control that. You can only control your own behavior. Now, I think a good place to start is think about, okay, what do I consider to be trustworthy, and then try to, produce that behavior of your own, right? But it's interesting if you take the exact same cases of behavior, and we're running out of time, but it really comes back to how they perceive it. So if you have a rookie and you don't give that person any direction, they're going to feel that you hung him out to dry. If you have an old grizzled veteran who'd been doing the job for 20 years and is very good at it, and you give them the same lack of direction, they're going to interpret that as, you trust me, you have confidence in my ability, and I don't need a lot of direction. So it's interesting, the same behavior on your part will lead to very different reactions on the part of the individual. And I always find that really interesting. And that's why I think it has to be discussed, because what makes you trust one person, right, is going to be different than what makes another person trust you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for the call. We appreciate it. Thanks for joining in tonight. Well, David, we're about coming down to the end of the hour.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to do, as we always do, is let you take a minute to tell people how to reach out to you if they would like to continue this conversation professionally with you. So we need phone number, website,
Sure.
what you'd be interested in.
Yeah. My phone number is 908-347-7793, the same number that we use for the call-in tonight. And my website is www.performanceleadershipsystems. And, what I'd like to lead the listeners with is kind of, some thought in terms of what is the level of trust within your organization. And if you could increase it, what would be the benefit? Or do you simply not care?
Well, let's hope that's not the answer, but I think it's an element that's when times are tight, these type of esoteric questions in most managers' minds get tossed to the side because it's the bottom line nuts and bolts they're worried about.
Well, did you ever see the Dilbert cartoon?
Sure.
And Dilbert comes walking back from a meeting and he says, how come every boss I ever has tells me that I shouldn't trust anybody in the organization but them? And
that kind of works for me.
yeah, but the problem is asking people to trust you or telling people that they can trust you. It's not going to really work. It's got to be earned.
Well, I hope that your assessment is right, that it's there in a lot more organizations than I perceive.
The smart ones.
And that's the ones we all want to work with.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for another very interesting and informative show.
Thanks, Bruce.
I hope that the listeners has gotten as much out of it as I have, and I hope that they contact you. Because if you have a small business or medium-sized business, an outside set of eyes with your expertise can go a long way to improve performance and profitability. Because sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees, and that's nobody's fault except it's your perspective.
Well, you're just too close to it.
Exactly. So you need a kind of a objective outside source to say, hey, take a look at this and evaluate it.
Yeah.
It's money well spent, and you've proven that many, many times over. So we thank you for being with us, Dave. We thank our listeners and viewers for being here at the Flemington Car and Truck Country Broadcast Center, and we are down on Main Street in Flemington, New Jersey. We'll be back next week. This is Bruce Pearson with you with David White from Performance Leadership Systems. right?
Yep.
Get it right.
You-
Okay.
yeah, you perfect.
In Port Murray, New Jersey.
Yeah.
That's correct. Thanks, folks. Have a good night. Be safe, and we'll see you next week. Same time here on the show. Bye-bye.